Hello everyone, hi. So today we'll be reading Bertolt Brecht's 1935 essay, Five Difficulties When Writing the Truth. Bertolt Brecht is arguably one of the most influential German playwrights and poets of the 20th century, and he's most known for his critique of societal structures, the political messages that he conveys in his texts, and the way in which he revolutionized theater. This essay specifically, I think, is as relevant today as it was almost 100 years ago. Brecht was writing in the dark times of the NS regime, and he saw the horror that was about to come into the world. Fearing persecution, Brecht left Nazi Germany in February 1933, just after Hitler came to power. And during the years of war, he wrote exile literature and expressed his opposition to the National Socialist and fascist movements in his plays Life of Galileo, Mother Courage and Her Children, and The Good Person of Sichuan. Even though the Nazis tried to destroy Brecht's work, they burned his books, they didn't succeed in destroying everything, and so this essay can be a guiding light still for us today. So let's unpack it together and see the wisdom that it has to offer us. I think this essay can be incredibly instructional, not just for writers, but for anyone who's in a position of seeking truth or conveying truth in their own way. So scientists, teachers, parents, even me, when scripting these YouTube videos, I sometimes have those principles in the back of my mind. As Brecht says in the introduction to his essay, nowadays, anyone who wishes to combat lies and ignorance and to write the truth must overcome at least 5 difficulties. He must have the courage to write the truth when truth is everywhere opposed, the keenness to recognize it, although it is everywhere concealed, the skill to manipulate it as a weapon, the judgment to select those in whose hands it will be effective, and the cunning to spread the truth among such persons. I'll also be reading a couple of paragraphs to you in German at the very end of the video, because I think it's nice to know what it actually sounds like in the original. And I also want to make you aware of an audio recording of this entire essay that is on YouTube. I'm going to link it in the description down below if you want to listen to the essay in full. And now, before we get into the video, let me just remind you of my Ko-fi account. If you're enjoying these videos and you're getting some valuable information from them, please consider supporting the channel financially. It really helps me out. In fact, I'm at the moment looking at a new camera I'm gonna buy that is gonna be entirely sponsored by my Ko-fi donations. So that's very exciting to finally be able to upgrade this camera and not having to get up every 15 minutes to press record again. It's gonna be just so much easier for me to make longer videos. So yeah, your contributions really help. Thank you to anyone who has already bought me a coffee or a part of this new camera. Your donations also help to keep ads off this channel, so I really appreciate you. Let's get into the essay now. So number 1, the courage to write the truth. Brecht opens this essay with 3 very important points. He says that in order to write truth, we are not to cringe before the powerful, we shouldn't betray the weak, and we have to tell the truth about ourselves. He says, quote, "It seems obvious that whoever writes should write the truth in the sense that he ought not to suppress or conceal truth, or write something deliberately untrue. He ought not to cringe before the powerful, nor betray the weak. It is, of course, very hard not to cringe before the powerful, and it is highly advantageous to betray the weak." So let's go through these points one by one. So he's telling us that it takes courage to not cringe before the powerful. It takes courage to oppose those that are more powerful than you are and those who'd rather not have you tell the truth. Your cause, in other words, has to be more important to you than fame, status, and frankly, being comfortable. It's like that Franklin Roosevelt quote that goes, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear." So in this case, whatever truth you're putting out into the world or are about to write has to be more important than that fear that you're feeling. Secondly, to not betray the weak means to keep those in mind who are oppressed and not to be swayed along the way by money, fame, and status. Brecht acknowledges how hard that is. And if you have ever read Animal Farm by George Orwell, you have the perfect example of how easy it is that those values can fly out the window as soon as people come to a little bit of power. It is easy to forget why you've started speaking up when you suddenly become famous or wealthy and belong to those upper classes where you don't have to worry about the needs of the people who have less than you. He says, quote, "To decline fame when it is offered by the mighty may mean to decline it forever." So whatever you stand in for, you might not be praised, you might not get wealth and fame, if you choose every step along the way that your cause is more important than that. And Brecht always thought that way. He thought, what happens to those that are unfortunate? His Three-Penny Opera, a novel of his, is a perfect example of that. The core message of that novel is that people become criminals because the system in which they live doesn't allow them to survive otherwise. If a system oppresses the well-being and education of the lowest members of society, you're forcing them into criminality. Brecht, of course, is an avid enemy of capitalism, and he says that in a capitalist system, one person has to constantly exploit another, and not only that, the person also has to permanently forget that this is the fact in order to live on. And so ideology is needed because of the amount of repression we have to employ living under those societal structures. So being a heretic in that way means keeping your eye on what is important even when no one else does. As Slavoj Žižek said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And Brecht goes on writing, quote, "Times of extreme oppression are usually times when there is much talk about high and lofty matters. At such times it takes courage to write of low and ignoble matters, such as food and shelter for workers. It takes courage when everyone else is ranting about the vital importance of sacrifice." And that is, I think, the development that is required of us. I always have to think about this quote by Ken Wilber. This is the book A Theory of Everything. And he says that, quote, "Development, in fact, can be defined as a successive decrease in egocentrism." And that is what Brecht employs us to do here. Let's keep reading. "When every radio station is blaring that a man without knowledge or education is better than one who has studied, it takes courage to ask, better for whom? He makes us aware of the fact that a revolution where the masses are not educated can only lead to a change of masters, or those are the words of George Orwell. I think those two would have gotten along very well. Must have been contemporaries, but I don't know if they knew each other. But it is the same story as in Animal Farm, right? The pigs liberating all the animals, only to them themselves turn into the masters and behave like the humans did before. That's, I think, what it really means to not betray the weakest members of society, right? To realize that education and knowledge is the basis of a more fair and just society. And Brecht, even in his quite immense success early on in his life, he didn't forget that. And I find that really admirable. And to enlighten the masses was also his aim in theater, right? He wanted to make the audience think and examine what's going on rather than simply entertaining them. Brecht also asks us at this point to tell the truth about ourselves, about our weaknesses, and to be direct and not get lost in lofty generalizations. He says, quote, "Naturally, in the struggle with falsehood, we must write the truth, and this truth must not be a lofty and ambiguous generality. When it is said of someone, he spoke the truth, this implies that some people or many people, or at least one person said something unlike the truth, a lie or a generality, but he spoke the truth. He said something practical, factual, undeniable, something to the point. It takes little courage to mutter a general complaint, in a part of the world where complaining is still permitted." And he comes back to that in point 3 later as well, where he says, "The man who does not know the truth expresses himself in lofty, general, and imprecise terms." So the last paragraph of this first point goes as follows. "There are many who pretend that canons are aimed at them, when in reality they are the target merely of opera glasses. They shout their generalized demands to a world of friends and harmless persons. They insist upon a generalized justice for which they have never done anything. They ask for generalized freedom and demand a share of the booty which they have long since enjoyed. They think that truth is only what sounds nice. If truth should prove to be something statistical, dry, or factual, something difficult to find and requiring study, they do not recognize it as truth. It does not intoxicate them. They possess only the external demeanor of truth-tellers. The trouble with them is they do not know the truth." Number 2. The keenness to recognize the truth. Brecht introduces this point by stating the following. "Since it is hard to write the truth, because truth is everywhere suppressed, it seems to most people to be a question of character whether the truth is written or not written. They believe that courage alone suffices. They forgot the second obstacle, the difficulty of finding the truth." So Brecht's main argument here is that there are many truths that are not worth writing about, and that too many poets and other writers focus on those. He says it's not worth writing that chairs have seats and rain follows downward. He says that those poets are, quote, "like a painter adorning the walls of a sinking ship with a still life. Our first difficulty does not trouble them, and their consciences are clear. Those in power cannot corrupt them, but neither are they disturbed by the cries of the oppressed. They go on painting. At the same time, it is not easy to realize that their truths are truths about chairs or rain. They usually sound like truths about important things, but on closer examination, it is possible to see that they say merely, 'A chair is a chair,' and 'No one can prevent the rain from falling down.'" So Brecht's political engagement really comes through here. He always criticizes art that looks away from the difficulties of current life and that does not have the imperative of lifting oppression. He says that those poets and those writers never find the truths that are worth writing about. Brecht famously critiqued Kafka for being too indirect and for not offering any practical solutions to his readers. Brecht also sees, though, that pure temperament and passion for current political issues are also not enough and lack the substance needed to write the truth. Passion alone is not enough. It needs to be supported by knowledge. And for that he says, quote, "In addition to temperament, knowledge, which can be acquired, and methods which can be learned, are needed. What is necessary for all writers in this age of perplexity and lightning change is a knowledge of the materialistic dialectic of economy and history. He further admits that insights without that background knowledge of economy and history, and without any research, are possible, but that those insights are not going to suffice to mobilize people for change. He says, quote, "Method is good in all inquiry, but it is possible to make discoveries without using any method, indeed even without any inquiry. But by such a casual procedure, one does not come to the kind of presentation of truth which will enable men to act on the basis of that presentations." So at the end of this point too, he says, if a person is ready to write the truth and able to recognize it, there remain 3 more difficulties. Number 3, the skill to manipulate the truth as a weapon. The first sentence goes as follows: "The truth must be spoken with a view to the results it will produce in the sphere of action." So I think this is what wise Zen masters and enlightened beings have taught us throughout the centuries, is that not every student is ready to hear the same kind of message, right? Not every person is capable of receiving the same kind of information. And often you also cannot be too direct. It really reminds me of this Emily Dickinson poem where she says, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." And I think this poem by Emily Dickinson sums up this point quite perfectly. Now, in this point 3, he also talks a lot about fascism and capitalism and how he thinks those two go together. I am going to read you a couple of paragraphs because I think they're very much worth considering, and I don't think I've ever seen the connection between fascism and capitalism pointed out so bluntly, and it has really made me think, let me put it that way. However, I'm not going to comment on it too much because this whole topic is just something that I personally don't know enough about to comment on. I just haven't learned enough about these issues, so I'm just going to leave it at the quotes, which again I think are very much worth considering. So he says, quote, "Fascism is a historic phase of capitalism. In this sense, it is something new and at the same time old. In fascist countries, capitalism continues to exist, but only in the form of fascism. And fascism can be combated as capitalism alone, as the nakedest, most shameless, most oppressive, and most treacherous form of capitalism. But how can anyone tell the truth about fascism unless he is willing to speak out against capitalism, which brings it forth?" And he goes on to talk about how fascism and capitalism support one another in his eyes. And he says, quote, "Those who are against fascism without being against capitalism, who lament over the barbarism that comes out of barbarism, are like people who wish to eat their veal without slaughtering the calf. They are willing to eat the calf, but they dislike the sight of blood. They are easily satisfied if the butcher washes his hands before weighing the meat. They are not against the property relations which engender barbarism. They are only against barbarism itself. They raise their voices against barbarism, and they do so in countries where precisely the same property relations prevail, but where the butchers wash their hands before weighing the meat." And in the last sentence of this point 3, he really encourages writers not to merely make readers aware of some links in a chain of causes, but to really penetrate to the true core issues of things. So he says, quote, "If one wishes successfully to write the truth about evil conditions, one must write it so that its avertible causes can be identified. If the preventable causes can be identified, the evil conditions can be fought. And this point of really going to the core of things or illuminating the true issue at the center of some topic seems straightforward enough, but it's striking how many people concern themselves only with links in chains and not with the source of things, and I include myself in here. Anyways, let's move on to point 4. The judgment to select those in whose hands the truth will be effective. The first paragraph of this point goes as follows. Quote, "The century-old custom of trade in critical and descriptive writing, and the fact that the writer has been relieved of concern for the destination of what he has written, have caused him to labor under a false impression. He believes that his customer or employer, the middleman, passes on what he has written to everyone. The writer thinks, I have spoken, and those who wish to hear will hear me. In reality, he has spoken, and those who are able to pay hear him. A great deal, though still too little, has been said about this. I merely want to emphasize that writing for someone has been transformed into merely writing. But the truth cannot merely be written. It must be written for someone who can do something with it. The process of recognizing truth is the same for writers and readers. In order to say good things, one's hearing must be good, and one must hear good things. The truth must be spoke deliberately and listened to deliberately. And for us writers, it is important to whom we tell the truth, and who tells it to us. Again, I think here the idea of educating the masses comes back, and of bringing information to those who it most matters to, and also to those who are ready to hear it. He says that, quote, "It is important for the writer to strike the true note of truth." On to the last point, number 5, the cunning to spread the truth among the many. So here he starts out by saying, many people, proud that they possess the courage necessary for the truth, happy that they have succeeded in finding it, perhaps fatigued by the labor necessary to put it into workable form, and impatient that it should be grasped by those whose interests are espousing, consider it superfluous to apply any special cunning in spreading the truth. For this reason, they often sacrifice the whole effectiveness of their work. At all times, cunning has been employed to spread the truth, whenever truth was suppressed or concealed. So this goes back, I think, to point 1, where he says that it takes a lot of courage to write the truth. It also takes a lot of courage to put whatever you've written or whatever you think out there. It feels vulnerable to put your creative heart on the chopping block, or your intellectual heart, or whatever you stand for. I actually have a quote hanging there on the back on my wall by Seth Godin, and it goes, "Art is a personal act of courage, something one person does that creates change in another." Right? So any form of art takes courage. It's scary to put yourself out there. It's still scary for me to put these videos out, So just having good thoughts or good ideas or artistic inspiration alone is not enough if you're not willing to spread it amongst people. In this point, Brecht further asks us to be precise with our wording, and he gives us some examples. He says, where opposition exists, the word obedience should be employed instead of discipline. For discipline can be self-imposed, and therefore has something noble in its character that obedience lacks. And a better word than honor is human dignity. The latter tends to keep the individual in mind. We all know very well what sort of scoundrels thrust themselves forward, clamoring to defend the honor of a people. I really read this point as a sort of Trojan horse endeavor, right, where you package up whatever you need or want to say in something that actually makes it deliverable. As an example, he says that the great Lucretius expressly says that one of the chief encouragements to spread the Epicurean atheism was the beauty of his verses. However, Brecht, being a dialectic thinker, immediately turns around and thinks about what he has said from the opposite angle as well. So he goes on saying, "It is indeed the case that the high literary level of a given statement can afford it protection. Often, however, it also arouses suspicion. In such case, it may be necessary to lower it deliberately." Brecht has criticized many writers for being too heady, amongst which Theodor W. Adorno. Brecht always is of the opinion that if the simple person cannot understand you anymore, then as a writer you're going wrong. So as Brecht finishes this text, he says that propaganda that stimulates thinking, in no matter what field, is useful to the cause of the oppressed. Such propaganda is very much needed. Under governments which serve to promote exploitation, thought is considered base. And that phrase, thought is considered base, he means that thinking is considered not very valuable, like base, like low, a low value, more or less. And that under such governments, quote, anything that serves those who are oppressed is considered base. Thinking is no longer taught anywhere, and wherever it does emerge, it is persecuted. Nevertheless, certain fields always exist in which it is possible to call attention to triumphs of thought without fear of punishment. These are the fields in which the dictatorships have need of thinking. For example, it is possible to refer to the triumph of thought in fields of military science and technology. I find it really interesting to think about what kind of thinking is seen as productive in our society and which is not. You know, I think if you're going to university nowadays and you go into technology, that seems to be a lot more highly regarded than studying philosophy, for example. Because again, of course, capitalism. Beautiful quote at the end of the text is as well, "What counts is that the right sort of thinking be taught, a kind of thinking that investigates the transitory and changeable aspect of all things and processes. Rulers have an intense dislike for significant changes. They would like to see everything remain the same, for 1,000 years, if possible. They would love it if sun and moon stood still." And then what comes out is really the beauty of his ability to think dialectically, you know, something that all the great thinkers are capable of doing, in my opinion. And what sets them apart is the ability to make a statement and then immediately see the opposite argument as well. And this quote expresses that quite wonderfully, I think. Another idea with which the victors can be confronted is that in everything and in every condition, a contradiction appears and grows. Such a view, that of dialectics, of the doctrines that all things flow and change, can be inculated in realms that for a time escape the notice of the rulers. It can be employed in biology or chemistry, for example, but it can also be indicated by describing the fate of a family, and here too, it need not arouse too much attention. The dependence of everything upon many factors which are constantly changing is an idea dangerous to dictators, and this idea can appear in many guises without giving the police anything to put their finger on. Governments which lead the masses into misery must guard against the masses thinking about government while they are miserable. Such governments talk a great deal about fate, It is fate, not they, which is to blame for all distress. Anyone who investigates the cause of the distress is arrested before he hits on the fact that the government is to blame. But it is possible to offer a general opposition to all this nonsense about fate. It can be shown that man's fate is made by men. So here we are at the end of this essay. So I really encourage you to read this essay on your own, actually, if you ever have a calm hour with a cup of coffee or something. I think it's valuable to be undisturbed and uninfluenced by me. See what you can get out of it. I'm going to read you the last few sentences of this essay, first in English and then, as promised, in German. And other than that, I'll see you again in the next video. All these 5 difficulties must be overcome at one and the same time, for we cannot discover the truth about barbarous conditions without thinking of those who suffer from them, cannot proceed unless we shake off every trace of cowardice. And when we seek to discern the true state of affairs in regard to those who are ready to use the knowledge we give them, we must also consider the necessity of offering them the truth in such a manner that it will be a weapon in their hands. And at the same time, we must do it so cunningly that the enemy will not discover and hinder our offer of the truth. That is what is required of a writer when he is asked to write the truth. Und all diese 5 Schwierigkeiten müssen wir zu ein und derselben Zeit lösen. Denn wir können die Wahrheit über barbarische Zustände nicht erforschen, ohne an die zu denken, welche darunter leiden. Und während wir immerfort jede Anwandlung von Feigheit abschüttelnd, die wahren Zusammenhänge im Hinblick auf die suchen, die bereit sind, ihre Kenntnisse zu benützen, müssen wir auch noch daran denken, ihnen die Wahrheit so zu reichen, dass sie eine Waffe in ihren Händen sein kann und zugleich so listig, dass diese Überreichung nicht vom Feind entdeckt und verhindert werden kann. So viel wird verlangt, wenn verlangt wird, der Schriftsteller soll die Wahrheit schreiben.